Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're so excited to be exploring another fascinating topic brought to us directly by one of you. Today we're looking at a stack of sources that tackle a subject many people feel they know inside and out: the Bible. It's a text, as these sources describe it, often held up as a perfect, consistent, unified word, quoted everywhere from legal courts to bedside tables. But the argument these sources make is that when you actually open it up and read it critically, you find something, well, different, significant inconsistencies and contradictions woven throughout.
Exactly. And our deep dive today isn't really about theology or taking a side in a religious debate. It's purely about understanding what the sources you shared say is present within the text itself. We're highlighting the specific areas they point out where different parts seem to tell different stories or, present conflicting ideas.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack the key contradictions highlighted in your material, see what they are, and understand why the authors of these sources believe they're significant. Our goal is just to help you be well-informed about this specific perspective on the Bible, based purely on the documents you provided.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive into this stack of sources and see what jumps out first. And according to the sources, the inconsistencies start right at the very beginning. Literally. They point out that the very first book, Genesis, presents two different creation accounts that seem to, well, conflict. What's the difference? Well, the material highlights that Genesis 1 describes God creating plants, then animals, then humans, specifically male and female together, sort of simultaneously. But then Genesis 2 presents a different order. Man is created first, then plants, then animals, and finally, woman is created from the man.
Right. And what your sources emphasize is that these aren't just stylistic variations. They present incompatible sequences of events. The argument is, if you view the Bible as a single, unified account, these immediately raise questions about consistency, you see.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving on to another incredibly famous story that most of us heard growing up: Noah's Ark. We all know the basic outline, but here's a question the sources pose. How many animals did Noah actually take onto the ark? Your material points out a difference between Genesis chapters. Genesis 6 says Noah is instructed to take 2 of every kind. Pretty straightforward, right?
Seems so.
But then Genesis 7 shifts the number, saying he should take 7 pairs of every clean animal and just 1 pair of the unclean ones.
Okay. 7 pairs, so 14 of the clean ones.
Exactly. Think about that. 2 of each, or 14 of some and 2 of others. As the sources kind of imply, imagine recounting a significant event today and not being able to decide if you brought 2 or 14 of something important. It really makes you question the details being presented.
It does. And what's fascinating is how the sources then pivot from these narrative accounts to look at something as foundational as the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Most people assume there's one definitive list given by God.
Right.
But your sources claim there isn't just one list presented in the Bible, there are multiple versions. They highlight that the list in Exodus 20 differs from the one in Deuteronomy 5. Okay, maybe some variation there. But perhaps most surprisingly, Exodus 34 contains a completely different set, which the text itself literally refers to as the 10 Commandments.
Wow. Okay. A third list.
A third list, and one odd example from that Exodus 24 list that the sources specifically point out is the rule, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. This detail, among others across the lists, leads the sources to ask, if there were 3 different versions, which one is the real list of the 10 Commandments? It's a fair question based on the text itself.
Yeah, it really is. The sources argue this pattern of inconsistency doesn't stop in the Old Testament. It continues right into the New Testament, particularly focusing on the resurrection of Jesus, which is obviously, a central event.
Absolutely central.
They lay out the conflicting accounts found across the 4 Gospels. Matthew says an angel rolls the stone away and speaks to the women. Mark says the women arrive to find the stone already rolled away and encounter a young man inside the tomb.
A young man, not an angel necessarily.
Right. Luke tells the story with 2 men in shining garments appearing.
2 men now.
And John's account says Mary Magdalene finds the stone removed, goes to tell the disciples, and later sees 2 angels inside.
Okay, so the number keeps changing.
The sources explicitly highlight the significant variations they see here. The number of heavenly or angelic visitors, what the witnesses saw, what they were told, and even when they saw Jesus post-resurrection, it all varies considerably depending on which gospel you read.
Yeah. And sticking with the New Testament, the sources identify the genealogies of Jesus found in Matthew and Luke as another area they describe as, well, quite frankly, a mess.
A mess. Okay.
The problem, as they explain it, is that both Gospels trace Jesus' lineage through Joseph. right? But the names don't line up after a certain point. King David, basically.
Hmm.
One line goes through King Solomon, the other through Nathan, Solomon's brother, and the number of generations between David and Jesus differs significantly. One list has 28, the other has 43.
43 versus 28, that's a big gap.
It's a huge gap, and what your sources find particularly noteworthy here is that not only do the lists disagree while both tracing Joseph's line, but if Jesus was virgin-born, as the Gospels claim, Joseph's lineage shouldn't even be biologically relevant anyway. That's the point they make.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, stepping back a bit, the sources broaden their scope from specific events and lists to conflicting ideas presented within the Bible, like the fundamental concept of salvation itself.
Yeah, core doctrines.
They present what they see as opposing views. Romans 3.28, attributed to the Apostle Paul, states that a person is justified by faith, not by works, just believe.
Faith alone.
However, James 2.24 clearly says, a person is justified by works, not by faith alone.
Whoa.
The sources highlight this as a direct contrast. They argue these are completely opposite teachings on a core religious idea, one saying belief is sufficient, the other stating that actions are necessary alongside faith. Can't have it both ways, they argue.
Right. This leads the sources to look at the very nature of God as depicted in different parts of the Bible, raising another important question they see about consistency.
How God is portrayed.
Exactly. They explain the contrasting images. In the Old Testament, in books like Exodus, God is portrayed as jealous and vengeful, stating he will punish children for the sins of their parents, down to the third and fourth generation.
Oof. Heavy stuff.
Yeah. But then in the New Testament, in 1 John, the text simply says God is love.
Just God is love. Quite different.
Quite different. The sources delve into this, arguing these aren't just different facets of a complex being, but radically different depictions. One image is presented as a sort of tribal warlord capable of intergenerational punishment, while the other is described as a cosmic source of compassion. The sources suggest that reconciling these images is incredibly difficult, unless you see them as maybe evolving ideas about God over time, written by different people.
Okay. Let's bring in a few more examples of conflicting laws and commands that your sources point to. They seem to have quite a few.
They do.
Dietary laws come up. Leviticus 11 gives clear prohibitions, including against eating shellfish, pork, things like that.
The kosher laws, basically.
Right. But then Mark 7 quotes Jesus declaring all foods clean, effectively overturning those rules.
A complete reversal, then.
Seems like it. Another one is Sabbath observance. Exodus says breaking the Sabbath is punishable by death, a severe penalty.
Death. Wow.
Yeah. But in the New Testament, Paul writes in Colossians saying not to let anyone judge you concerning the Sabbath. How you observe it is up to you.
So again, a major shift.
The sources describe these changes not as minor clarifications, but as outright reversals of previous divine law.
And it's not just laws and narratives. Numerical and factual conflicts are also highlighted in this material.
Like numbers not adding up.
Exactly. They use the census example again. Remember King David taking a census?
Uh-huh.
But Samuel 24 says God tells David to take the census. It's a divine command.
Okay.
But then 1 Chronicles 21 attributes the same event to Satan prompting David.
Wait, God or Satan?
That's the question the sources ask.
Yeah.
Which was it? Was David following God or yielding to Satan? The texts disagree on the instigator.
That's pretty fundamental.
And it gets better. The numbers resulting from that census. Samuel reports 800,000 fighting men in Israel and 500,000 in Judah.
Okay, big numbers.
Chronicles reports 1.1 million in Israel and 470,000 in Judah.
Those aren't even close.
Not close at all. Your sources explicitly state these aren't just minor transcription errors or typos. They are found in different books, written by different authors at different times, presenting conflicting numerical data for the same event.
Wow. Okay, so we've seen contradictions in stories, laws, numbers, but your sources also delve into what they see as profound theological contradictions and issues with morality presented in the text.
Yeah, this gets into some really difficult territory.
They discuss the portrayal of God and suffering, citing the book of Job, where God allows Satan to completely destroy a righteous man's life and family just to win a sort of cosmic bet about Job's faithfulness.
Testing him, basically, but in a brutal way.
Exactly. And they point to Romans 9, where Paul is quoted as saying, God makes some people vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, just so his power can be shown through them.
Prepared for destruction.
The sources don't mince words here, calling this portrayal cruelty, not love. It's a harsh assessment based on those passages.
And the material broadens this to overall morality. The sources argue the Bible condones practices that contradict modern moral understanding and even other parts of the Bible. They specifically cite slavery, noting rules for buying, beating, and inheriting slaves without any outright commandment against the practice itself. It's just regulate.
Regulated, not forbidden.
Right. Yet they contrast this with Paul's statement in Galatians that in Christ there is neither slave nor free. So the sources ask, is slavery acceptable or not according to a consistent biblical standard? Which passage takes precedence?
Good question.
They also mention other harsh laws presented, like Deuteronomy's command to stone a rebellious child to death.
Stone your child.
That's what it says. This is placed alongside verses describing God as merciful. The sources highlight how the material also points to the condoning of war, child marriage, rape in certain contexts, and death penalties for seemingly trivial acts like picking up sticks on the Sabbath.
Picking up sticks.
Numbers 15. Their argument is that a text presented as a perfect moral guide shouldn't require constant reinterpretation to fit modern ethics or contain commands that seem to contradict basic human dignity.
Okay. Beyond internal textual conflicts, your sources also highlight areas where the Bible seems to contradict reality as we understand it, based on scientific and historical evidence.
Yeah, the Bible versus science kind of thing.
They list examples like the Earth not being 6,000 years old, which literal reading might suggest, talking snakes not existing, people not surviving inside large fish for 3 days, the sun not literally stopping in the sky.
Right, things that clash with physics or biology.
The point your sources emphasize here is that these events were presented as literal in their context, and for centuries people believed them because they were in the Bible. They argue that the contradictions with observable facts are so overwhelming that even most religious scholars today concede many of these parts cannot be taken literally. They have to be interpreted metaphorically or allegorically.
Which is itself an interpretive move, right? Okay, let's look at prophecy next, as your sources identify challenges with perceived prophecy fulfillment. This is a big one for biblical claims.
Prophecy.
They bring up the claim in Matthew that Jesus fulfilled a prophecy about being called a Nazarene, Matthew 2.23.
Right, Jesus of Nazareth.
But your sources state no such specific prophecy exists anywhere in the Old Testament. They argue Matthew might be referencing something general or maybe misunderstood something, but the specific quote isn't there.
Okay.
Another example is Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Matthew says he rode in on both a donkey and a colt simultaneously, linking it to a prophecy in Zechariah 9.9.
2 animals at once.
That's how Matthew describes it.
Yeah.
But your sources note that Zechariah only mentions one animal, a donkey, even a colt. They argue Matthew likely misunderstood a common Hebrew poetic structure called parallelism, where you repeat an idea for emphasis, not describe two separate things. So they argue Matthew forced the fulfillment by describing an impossible scenario writing 2 animals. They label this misreading rather than prophecy come true.
That's quite a claim.
And they point to the prophecy regarding the city of Tyre in Ezekiel 26. Ezekiel prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, would completely destroy Tyre, scrape it clean like a bare rock.
Total destruction by Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes. However, history shows Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city for 13 years and failed to conquer the island part of Tyre completely. He damaged the mainland part, but didn't obliterate it as prophesied. It was Alexander the Great who succeeded much later, using rubble from the mainland city to build a causeway to the island.
So the specific prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar failed.
According to the historical record cited by the sources, yes. They call attempts to say the prophecy was eventually fulfilled by Alexander revisionism, shifting the goalposts from Ezekiel's specific prediction about Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay. Your sources also raise a theological contradiction regarding free will versus divine control. This is a classic philosophical problem, too.
Absolutely.
The example they use is the story of Moses and Pharaoh in Exodus. The Bible repeatedly says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, causing him to refuse Moses' request to let the Israelites go.
God hardened his heart. It says that explicitly.
Right. What your sources conclude from this is striking. They argue it means Pharaoh didn't choose to refuse. God actively forced him to refuse. God made him do it. And then God punished Pharaoh in Egypt severely for a decision God himself had orchestrated. The sources argue this is presented not as free will, but as divine manipulation, which seems contradictory to the idea of a just God judging people for their choices.
Yeah, if God forces the choice, is it really a choice? And is the punishment just? That's the crux of their point. And this ties into how the sources see the concept of justice evolving within the Bible itself, contrasting the Old and New Testaments.
How so?
They explain the difference. The Old Testament presents a demand for strict reciprocal justice, famously summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, lex talionis.
Right, very direct justice.
But then the New Testament quotes Jesus saying things like, "Turn the other cheek, love your enemies, forgive those who wrong you." A very different approach.
Completely different emphasis.
Your sources argue these represent evolving ideas of justice presented across different periods and authors, reflecting changing cultural norms and theological insights, rather than a single, eternal, consistent standard of divine justice revealed all at once.
Okay. Shifting to historical accuracy, your sources claim there are conflicts here as well, beyond just the scientific stuff, like specific historical events.
Yes, relating to dating and context.
They detail an issue with Luke's birth narrative of Jesus. Luke 2 says Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem for a census decreed by Caesar Augustus, which took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Right, the Christmas story census.
Historical records place Quirinius's relevant governorship and census around 6 CE.
Okay, 6 CE.
However, the same gospel, Luke 1, clearly states Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great.
And Herod the Great died.
Herod the Great died around 4 BCE.
So 4 BCE versus 6 CE.
That's a gap of at least 10 years. The problem your sources highlight is that you can't have Jesus' birth occurring during both Quirinius' census, around 6 CE, and Herod's reign, ending 4 BCE. Yet the story, as presented in Luke according to the sources, seems to require both elements, the census to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, and Herod's reign for the context of the Magi and the slaughter of the innocents mentioned in Matthew's account. Though not Luke's, it's a chronological tangle.
A definite tangle. The sources also bring up inconsistencies regarding specific people within the narrative itself. Minor characters, maybe, but still inconsistencies.
Like who?
Take the 12 disciples. The lists provided in the Gospels aren't exactly the same. Matthew and Mark mention a disciple named Thaddeus. But Luke's list, in both his Gospel and the book of Acts, includes Judas, son of James, instead of Thaddeus.
So Thaddeus or Judas, son of James.
Your sources ask if these are the same person, which some traditions suggest, or different people. If different, which list is considered the correct one? The Bible itself doesn't clarify.
Well, what else?
Or Paul's conversion story. Saul becoming Paul on the road to Damascus. Hugely important event.
Foundational for Christianity.
Right. The book of Acts actually tells this story 3 separate times in chapter 9, chapter 22, and chapter 26.
3 times. You'd think they'd get it consistent.
Well, your sources point out that the accounts don't fully agree on the details. For instance, in Acts 9, the men traveling with Paul hear the voice speaking to him, but see no one.
Heard voice, saw nothing. Got it.
In Acts 22, Paul recounts that the men saw the light, but did not hear the voice addressing him.
Saw light, heard nothing. Opposite.
Exactly. And in Acts 26, Paul gives another version to King Agrippa, which contains further variations in what was said and done. The sources find it remarkable that even a pivotal event like Paul's conversion is recorded inconsistently across different chapters of the very same book.
Yeah, that is surprising.
And perhaps most strikingly, the fate of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. How did he die?
Oh, right. There are different stories, aren't there?
There are. Matthew 27 says Judas felt remorse, returned the 30 silver pieces, threw them into the temple, and then went away and hanged himself.
Hanged himself. Okay.
But Acts 1 gives a completely different account. It says Judas used the betrayal money to buy a field, and there, falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his intestines gushed out.
Whoa, that's graphically different. Hanging versus falling and bursting open.
Fundamentally different causes and manners of death. Your sources call these fundamentally incompatible deaths and suggest that if the Bible can't agree on how a key figure like Judas died, it raises serious questions about the reliability and confidence one can place in other historical or biographical details presented throughout the text.
That's a heavy point. Okay, let's look at how your sources say God himself is portrayed regarding truthfulness and deception. Does God always tell the truth?
An interesting question they tackle.
They present seemingly conflicting verses. Proverbs 12.22 says, "The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy." Seems clear enough. God hates lies.
Pretty straightforward.
But then Thessalonians 2.11 says that during the end times, God sends a powerful delusion so that people will believe a lie leading to their condemnation.
God sends a delusion. So God causes deception.
That's what the verse seems to say.
Yeah.
And 1 Kings 22 describes a scene in heaven where God explicitly allows a lying spirit to go and entice King Ahab into a fatal battle by putting lies in the mouths of his prophets. God authorizes the deception.
Okay, so God detests lies, but also sends lies and authorizes lying spirits.
This leads the sources to pose the question, is God fundamentally opposed to deception, or does he use it as a tool when it serves his purposes? They argue that both statements cannot be consistently true within the same moral framework for a divine being. It looks contradictory.
Yeah, that's a tough one theologically. The sources also trace what they see as an evolution in the portrayal of another key figure, Satan.
Satan. How does his portrayal change?
They explain the shift. In the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Job, Satan, the Hebrew word ha-Satan means the accuser or the adversary, is presented as a member of God's divine council, one of the sons of God. He acts as a sort of prosecuting attorney, testing humans, but always with God's explicit permission. There's no hint of cosmic rebellion against God himself in these early texts.
So, like part of the heavenly staff almost?
In a sense, yes. But in the New Testament, Satan becomes the ultimate enemy, the cosmic rebel, the ruler of demons, explicitly stated as having been cast out of heaven, the arch-nemesis of God and humanity.
A huge transformation.
A huge transformation. What the sources observe is that the Bible itself never clearly tells the story of this radical shift. How did the heavenly accuser become the ultimate evil? They argue this New Testament portrayal is often constructed by later interpreters patching together verses from the Old Testament, like Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, that they believe aren't actually about Satan in their original context, but about human kings.
So the backstory isn't really in the Bible itself?
Not clearly laid out, according to these sources. They find it significant that this massive shift in a central spiritual character is largely unexplained within the text itself, but underpins entire doctrines about spiritual warfare and the nature of evil in later Christian thought.
Interesting. Your sources also find contradictions related to the concept of prayer itself. How effective is it? What's its purpose?
Yeah, even prayer isn't straightforward, they argue.
They present these opposing ideas. Jesus is quoted in Matthew 21:22 as saying, "Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." And John 14:14, "If you ask anything in my name, I will do it." Seems like an absolute promise, ask and receive.
A blank check, almost.
But then the book of James, James 4:3 states, "When you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." So there are conditions you might not receive if your motives are bad.
Okay, so not quite a blank check then.
Right. And the sources highlight the further question they raise here. If, as Matthew 6:8 also quotes Jesus saying, "Your Father already knows what you need before you even ask him," what exactly is the ultimate purpose or point of prayer in the first place? Is it to inform God? To change God's mind? Or something else? The sources find the Bible's own presentation on prayer somewhat ambiguous or contradictory.
And they bring up how your sources argue these inconsistencies aren't just abstract theological points, but affect real-world issues, like marriage and family structure.
Marriage? How so?
They explain the inconsistency they see. In some parts of the Old Testament, key figures revered as righteous, like Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon, are shown having multiple wives and concubines. Polygamy seems accepted, even celebrated in places as a sign of blessing or status.
Right. Many wives were common for kings.
Yes. But in the New Testament, particularly in Paul's letters like 1 Timothy and Titus, monogamy, one husband, one wife, becomes the clear standard, especially for church leaders.
So a definite shift in the ideal.
A definite shift. The sources note the question this raises for people trying to follow the Bible today. Which standard is the correct one? Polygamy or monogamy? And if God's view changed on something as fundamental as the structure of marriage, why did it change? Was the Old Testament practice wrong or just superseded? They suggest this looks more like cultural evolution reflected in the text, tracking societal changes, rather than a single, consistent divine standard revealed for all time.
Okay. Dietary laws come up again, but specifically in the context of their changing status across the Testaments.
Yeah, we touched on this, but it's a key example of reversal for them.
We already mentioned the Old Testament prohibitions in Leviticus against things like pork and shellfish, very detailed lists.
Unclean foods.
Right. But the sources explain the dramatic shift shown in the New Testament book of Acts, chapter 10. The Apostle Peter has a vision. He sees a sheet lowered from heaven containing all sorts of animals, including those considered unclean.
The unclean ones specifically.
Yes. And a voice tells him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter initially refuses, saying he's never eaten anything impure or unclean, but the voice replies, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean."
A direct command overturning the old rules.
Exactly. This vision is widely interpreted as signaling that the old Jewish dietary laws are no longer binding for followers of Christ, especially as the faith spread to non-Jews.
Right.
But your sources contrast this with the words attributed to Jesus himself in Matthew 5:18, where he says emphatically that until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished.
So Jesus says the law remains. Peter's vision seems to say parts are gone.
That's the conflict the sources highlight. They argue you can't logically hold both ideas simultaneously. Either the old laws, including dietary ones, are still binding in their entirety, as Jesus seemed to suggest, or they aren't, as Peter's vision and later church practice indicated. The text seems to present fundamentally conflicting answers on the status of the law.
And another look at the concept of judgment itself reveals inconsistencies, according to your sources, judging others.
To judge or not to judge.
Basically, they present these conflicting commands. Jesus is famously quoted in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:1, saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." A clear command against judging others, right?
Sounds very clear.
But just a few verses later in the same sermon, Matthew 7:1, 13, 16, Jesus tells his followers to watch out for false prophets whom you will recognize by their fruits. Recognizing them by their fruits implies making a judgment about their character and teachings. He's instructing them to judge who is authentic and who isn't.
So don't judge, but also judge false prophets.
Seems like it. And then the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2:15 that the spiritual person judges all things, but is himself judged by no one, implying judgment is actually a characteristic of spiritual maturity.
Okay, so it's getting complicated.
It is. Your sources pose the question this raises. Are believers supposed to judge others, or are they explicitly commanded not to judge, or only judge certain things? The sources suggest this kind of inconsistency reflects different voices, maybe different situations, or even different agendas captured within the text, rather than a single harmonious message on a clear command.
Right. Gender roles are another area your sources highlight as presenting contradictions. This is obviously a huge topic today.
Huge and deeply contested, often using biblical texts.
They explain the conflict they perceive. Genesis 1:27 states that God created humankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. This seems to present a foundation of equality in creation. Both sexes reflect God's image.
Equality in the beginning.
But then, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 14 that women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak. And in 1 Timothy 2, he writes, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." And even suggests women will be saved through childbearing.
Very different messages about women's roles and status. Silence versus being created in God's image.
Exactly. Your sources note that these later Pauline ideas not only seem to contradict the earlier Genesis account of equality, but, in their view, also contradict basic human dignity and modern values of gender equality. They suggest that in practice, even many believers today often follow modern values regarding women's roles in society and church, rather than adhering strictly to these specific biblical verses promoting silence or limiting roles for women, which itself highlights the tension.
Attention indeed. And finally, one more specific example. How the sources describe conflicting accounts of whether or not human beings have actually seen God. Can God be seen?
Oh, interesting. What's the conflict there?
They explain the problem. Some verses state explicitly that seeing God is impossible or fatal. Exodus 33:20 says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." John 1:1 states flatly, "No one has ever seen God." 1 Timothy 6:16 describes God as dwelling in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see. Seems definitive.
Cannot see God and live? No one has seen God.
Okay. Yet other parts of the Bible describe people apparently doing just that. Exodus 33, just verses before saying Moses can't see God's face, describes God speaking to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Later in the chapter, Moses is allowed to see God's back.
Face to face, then sees his back.
It's confusing. Genesis 32 describes Jacob wrestling with a figure all night, who Jacob identifies as God, saying, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Isaiah 6 describes the prophet Isaiah seeing the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne in the temple.
So multiple accounts of seeing God.
Multiple accounts. The sources highlight that these encounters aren't always presented as purely metaphorical visions. They're often described as real, tangible interactions or sightings. Yet other texts within the same Bible claim this is impossible or has never happened. The sources find it contradictory that the text claims both situations having seen God directly and no one ever having seen God have occurred or are true statements. It's another unresolved tension they point to.
Okay, so After laying out all these examples, creation, Noah, commandments, resurrection, genealogies, salvation, God's nature, laws, numbers, morality, science, prophecy, free will, justice, history, disciples, Judas's death, God's truthfulness, Satan, prayer, marriage, dietary laws, judgment, gender, seeing God. Wow, that's a lot.
It is a lot. The sources cover a wide range.
Let's transition to the overall conclusion that your sources draw from all these perceived contradictions. What's the big picture for them?
Right. What does it all mean, according to this material?
They explain their core argument. The Bible, in their view, isn't a single seamless book written with one voice or unified message. It wasn't dictated word for word by God and perfectly preserved. Instead, they see it as a collection, a library of writings by many different human authors from vastly different time periods, cultures, and with varying beliefs and agendas, spanning over 1,000 years.
A library, not a single book. That's a common way some scholars put it.
Right. And they argue that the text isn't just inconsistently edited, it actively preserves and reflects the internal disagreements, the debates, the evolving understandings of the ancient communities who produced it, their struggles with concepts like vengeance versus mercy, strict legalism versus grace, tribalism versus universalism.
All captured in the text.
Exactly. The sources argue that the Bible presents all these different voices and ideas, often side by side, without necessarily resolving them into a single, coherent theological system. For them, it's less of a unified divine revelation and more of a record of human struggle, projection, fear, and myth, reflecting humanity's attempt to understand the divine and their place in the world over centuries.
And adding to that perspective, the sources believe these contradictions shouldn't be seen just as errors to be explained away or harmonized by clever interpretation. Instead, they are presented as clues or fingerprints left by the human authors, evidence of the human element.
Fingerprints, how so?
They argue these inconsistencies show that the writers were ordinary people, writing from their own time, culture, and limited understanding, grappling with big questions rather than being simply perfect, passive channels automatically transmitting infallible divine truth. Their humanity shows through, flaws and all.
Okay.
The sources make a comparison here. They state that no editor would ever accept this level of internal contradiction in other kinds of important books today. Imagine a modern science textbook with 4 different conflicting accounts of the same core scientific principle, or a history book where a major historical figure demonstrably dies in 2 entirely different ways in different chapters.
It wouldn't get published, or it would be heavily criticized.
It would be questioned, rejected, or seen as unreliable. But the sources contend, when it comes to the Bible, because of its sacred status, these same kinds of inconsistencies are often ignored, excused, rationalized, or spiritualized away through complex interpretation, rather than being acknowledged straightforwardly for what the sources believe they are. Clear evidence of multiple human hands, minds, perspectives, and inevitable inconsistencies over a long period of writing and compilation.
And briefly touching on the practical implications your sources discuss, how does this view of the Bible, full of contradictions, affect its use as a moral compass in the world today?
Yeah, the real-world impact.
They explain the argument that the sources make. Precisely because of its internal conflicts and diverse perspectives, the Bible can be, and historically has been, selectively quoted and interpreted to justify completely opposite positions on critical moral and social issues. You can find verses to support condemning slavery, and other verses used to justify owning slaves. Verses used to advocate for war and violence, others promoting peace and non-resistance. Verses used to justify the oppression of women, others used to argue for their equality.
It cuts both ways on many issues.
Exactly. The sources claim that the same text, depending entirely on which verses or passages are emphasized, ignored, or interpreted in a certain way, can be used to support vastly different, even opposing ethical conclusions and social actions. They call this potential outcome moral chaos, arguing it undermines claims of the Bible being a clear, unambiguous guide.
And circling back one last time, the sources bring up those failed end times prophecies again as another key example of contradiction they highlight, one with significant weight.
The timing of the end times.
Right. They reiterate the points. Jesus telling his immediate followers, the disciples right there with him, that the end of the age and his glorious return would happen within their specific lifetime. He explicitly says in Mark 13, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened."
This generation seems pretty specific.
It does. And the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Thessalonians 4, clearly expecting to be personally alive for the second coming of Christ. He speaks of, "we who are alive who are left until the coming of the Lord." including himself in that group.
Okay, so both Jesus and Paul expected it soon.
That's how the sources read those passages literally, and their analysis is blunt. That generation Jesus spoke to passed away nearly 2,000 years ago. Paul died. These end-time events didn't happen as predicted in that time frame. The sources argue this means either Jesus was wrong in his prediction, if accurately reported, or the gospel accounts inaccurately record his words. Either way, they see it as a major contradiction with enormous theological weight, challenging core claims about Jesus' knowledge or the Bible's accuracy.
And what about interpretations that say this generation meant something else, or the prophecies are symbolic?
The sources address that, suggesting that subsequent attempts by various groups over centuries to reinterpret this generation to mean something other than the people alive at the time, or to redate or spiritualize these prophecies to fit later times, is simply moving the goalposts. It's seen as trying to fix a failed prediction after the fact, not genuine prophecy fulfillment as originally stated.
Okay, so wrapping up. Your sources conclude by emphasizing that, from their perspective, the Bible's contradictions aren't just abstract academic points for scholars to debate in ivory towers.
Not just theoretical.
No, they argue these inconsistencies directly affect people's real lives, influence laws and public policy, shape core beliefs and behaviors for millions, sometimes with harmful consequences. In their view, these aren't just simple errors to be ignored or harmonized away with interpretive gymnastics. They are presented as fundamental evidence of the Bible's true nature, as a complex, often conflicting collection, reflecting its very human origins and development over time.
So to summarize the core argument from the sources you've shared and we've dug into today, the material presents the Bible not as a seamless, divinely unified, and internally consistent text from Genesis to Revelation, but rather as a complex collection, a library, reflecting diverse human voices, evolving ideas, cultural influences, and sometimes starkly contradictory accounts and concepts gathered across many centuries and cultures.
And reiterating the perspective found in these sources, they suggest this means approaching the Bible perhaps not as a single, infallible rulebook with one clear, unchanging divine voice, but instead maybe as a profoundly influential historical artifact shaped by humans, full of their insights, their aspirations, but also their flaws, their biases, their fears, and yes, their contradictions. This deep dive into your sources certainly gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
It really encourages us, and you listening, to look closely at texts that are incredibly influential and often taken for granted, and to really consider the different layers, the different voices, and the diverse perspectives contained within them.
And that brings us to a provocative thought for you to consider, based on everything we've discussed from this material. If the Bible contains so many internal contradictions and reflects the diverse biases and limitations of its many human authors across centuries, as these sources forcefully argue, what does that ultimately imply for how we understand its authority, its message, and its role in the world today? How should one read it, use it, or relate to it, knowing about these internal tensions?
What stands out to you after hearing this perspective presented in the sources? It's a lot to process. We encourage you to explore these sources and these challenging questions further on your own. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.